Welcome back, Eagles. Thank you for joining me on day 2 of our Read Aloud read along. We are reading J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, and yesterday we read only 6 pages. It's quite a long book. If you're following along on the PDF, we are at page 28, paragraph 2, so just down from the top if you're following along that way. So again, we'll read for about 15 minutes or until I find a really good cliffhanger, and then we'll stop. What on earth did I ask him to tea for? He said to himself as he went to the pantry. He had only just had breakfast, but he thought a cake or two and a drink of something would do him good after his fright. Gandalf, in the meantime, was still standing outside the door and laughing long but quietly. After a while, he stepped up and with a spike on his staff scratched a queer sign into the Hobbit's beautiful green front door. Then he strode away just about the time when Bilbo was finishing his second cake and beginning to think that he had escaped adventures very well. The next day, he had almost forgotten about Gandalf. He did not remember things very well unless he put them down on his engagement tablet, like this: Gandalf, tea, Wednesday. Yesterday he had been too flustered to do anything of the kind. Just before tea time there came a tremendous ring on the front doorbell, and then he remembered. He rushed and put on the kettle and put out another cup and saucer and an extra cake or two and ran to the door. "I am so sorry to keep you waiting," he was going to say, when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf with a blue beard tucked into a golden belt, very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed inside, just as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg, and "Dwalin at your service," he said with a low bow. "Bilbo Baggins at yours," said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence that followed had become uncomfortable, he added, "I am just about to take tea. Pray come and have some with me." A little stiff, perhaps, but he meant it kindly. "And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation?" They had not been at table long. In fact, they had hardly reached the third cake, when there came another, even louder ring at the bell. "Excuse me," said the hobbit, and off he went to the door. "So you've got here at last." That was what he was going to say to Gandalf this time, but it was not Gandalf. Instead, there was a very odd-looking dwarf on the step with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside as soon as the door was open, just as if he had been invited. "I see they have begun to arrive already," he said when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it, and "Balin at your service," he said, with a hand on his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but "they have begun to arrive" had flustered him badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then he, as the host, he knew his duty and stuck to it, however painful he might have to go without. "Come along in, have some tea," he managed to say after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better if it's all the same to you, my good sir," said Balin with the white beard, "but I don't mind some cake. Seed cake, if you have any." "Lots," Bilbo found himself answering, to his own surprise, and he found himself scuttling off, too, to the cellar to fill a pint beer mug, and then to a pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes, which he had baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he got back, Balin and Dwalin were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them, when loud came a ring at the bell again, and then another ring. Gandalf for certain this time, he thought, as he puffed along the passage. But it was not. It was 2 more dwarves, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped as soon as the door began to open. Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "What can I do for you, my dwarfs?" he said. "Keely at your service," said the one, "and Feely," added the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. I'm never sure how to say these names. Dwalin? Dwalin? Dwalin. Dwalin and Balin. "Here already, I see," said Keely. "Let us join the throng." Throng, thought Mr. Baggins. I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits and have a drink. He had only just had a sip in the corner while the four dwarves sat around the table and talked about mines and gold and troubles with the goblins and the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand and did not want to, for they sounded too much adventurous, when ding-dong-a-ling-dang, his bell rang again as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "Some four, I should say, by the sound," said Feely. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands and wondered what had happened and what was going to happen and whether they would all stay to supper. Then the bell rang again louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. It was not 4, after all, it was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wondering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, at your service, one after another. Dory, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were their names, and very soon 2 purple hoods, a gray hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging on the pegs, and off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, and some for porter, and one for coffee, and all of them for cake, so the hobbit was kept very busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had just been set on the hearth. The seed cakes were gone, and the dwarves were starting on a round of buttered scones, when there came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry and altogether bewildered and bewildered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of the other. More dwarves, 4 more. And there was Gandalf behind, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent on the beautiful door. He had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he had put there the morning before. Carefully, he said. "It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat and then open the door like a popgun. Let me introduce Bifur, Bofur, Bombur, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Bifur, Bofur, and Bombur, standing in a row. They hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This last belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf. In fact, no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not at all pleased at having fallen flat on Bilbo's mat with Bifur, Bofur, and Bombur on top of him. For one thing, Bombur was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin indeed was very haughty and said nothing about service, but poor Mr. Baggins said he was sorry so many times that at last he grunted, "Pray don't mention it," and stopped frowning. "Now we are all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering. I hope there is something left for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? No, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for me." "And for me," said Thorin. "And raspberry jam and apple tart," said Bifur. "And mince pies and cheese," said Bofur. "And pork pie and salad," said Bombur. "And more cakes and ale and coffee, if you don't mind," called the other dwarfs through the door. "Put on a few eggs, too, there's a good fellow," Gandalf called after him as the hobbits stumped off to the pantries. "And just bring out the cold chicken and pickles." "Seems to know as much about the inside of my larders as I do myself," thought Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed and was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he had got all of the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face and annoyed. "Confusticate and bebother these dwarves," he said aloud. "Why don't they come and lend a hand?" Lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of the kitchen, and Feely and Keely behind them, and before he could say knife, they had whisked the trays and a couple of small tables into the parlor and set out everything afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with the 13 dwarves all round, and Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside nibbling at a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least bit an adventure. The dwarves ate and talked, and time got on. At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. "I suppose you will all stay to supper?" he said in his politest, unpressing tones. "Of course," said Thorin, "and after. We shan't get through the business till late, and we must have some music first. Now, to clear up." Thereupon the 12 dwarves, not Thorin, he was too important, and stayed talking to Gandalf, jumped to their feet and made tall piles of all the things. Off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on top with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, squeaking with fright. "Please be careful!" and "Oh, please don't trouble, I can manage." But the dwarves only started to sing. Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks. Cut the cloth and tread on the fat. Pour the milk on the pantry floor. Leave the bones on the bedroom mat. Splash the wine on every door. Dump the crocks in a boiling bowl. Pound them up with a thumping pole. And when you've finished, if any are whole, send them down the hall to roll. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates, so carefully, carefully with the plates. And of course, they did none of these dreadful things, and everything was cleaned and put away safe, as quick as lightning, while the hobbit was turning around and around in the middle of the kitchen trying to see what they were doing. Then they went back and found Thorin with his feet on the fender smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and wherever he told one to go, it went. Up the chimney, or behind the clock on the mantelpiece, or under the table, or round and round on the ceiling. But wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! He sent a smaller smoke ring through from his short clay pipe straight through each one of Thorin's. Then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back to hover over the wizard's head. He had a cloud of them about him already, and in the dim light it made him look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood still and watched. He loved smoke rings. And then he blushed to think how proud he had been yesterday morning of the smoke rings that he'd sent up the wind over the hill. "And now for some music," said Thorin. "Bring out the instruments." And we're going to stop there. I suspect that Bilbo is not going to like the direction that the rest of his evening takes. It does seem like it's a pretty raucous crowd. Raucous meaning very active and excited and lots of energy, and he seems like he likes a much quieter evening. We know that hobbits don't like any kind of adventures or anything that's improper. So that was part 2 of chapter 1. We will finish chapter 1 tomorrow. I think we'll get through that chapter. Again, thank you so much for joining me for our Read Aloud, Read Along of The Hobbit, and I will see you tomorrow.